We're going to stay in one chapter here of the book of 1 Samuel this morning, and that is 1 Samuel chapter 25, and we're going to look at a story that I think has just been a really fascinating and intriguing story here in this part of 1 Samuel. And this story introduces us to some other personalities in this book, and I think presents us and challenges us in maybe a little different way than some of the rest of this book. But it's a fascinating story here. I'd like to begin, first of all, before we read the scripture lesson, I'd like to begin with this illustration. Young lady by the name of Rosina Hernandez was in college, and she once attended a rock concert at which a young man was brutally beaten by someone else. It says here that no one had made an attempt to stop the beating, and the next day, this young lady was struck dumb to learn that this youth had died as a result of the pounding that he took. Yet neither she nor anyone else had raised a hand to help him. She could never seem to forget that incident, and her responsibility, at least in her own mind, of her inactivity as a bystander. And so some years later, Rosina saw another catastrophe. There was a car driving in the rain ahead of her that suddenly skidded and plunged into the Biscayne Bay. The car landed head down in the water with only the taillights showing and sticking up out of the water. And in a moment, a woman appeared on the surface of the water shouting for help and saying that her husband was stuck inside. This time, Rosina waited for no one. She plunged into the water, tried unsuccessfully to open the door, and then pounded on the back window as other bystanders stood on the causeway and watched. First, she screamed at them, begging for help, and telling them that there was a man dying in this car. First one man and then another finally came to help. Together they broke the safety glass and dragged the man out. They were just in time. A few minutes later, and it would have been too late. The woman thanked Rosina for saving her husband, and Rosina was elated, riding in an emotional high that lasted for weeks. She had promised herself years ago that she would never again fail to do anything she could to save a human life. And this time she had made good on her promise. I share that this morning as an introduction to this story because it gives us an example of someone who, in the midst of a unexpected circumstance, did not allow inactivity and indecision to freeze her and cause her to just stand and watch. We see here in this story that we were about to look into here in 1 Samuel 25 an occasion of a woman who takes not only her own life but the life of her whole family and the whole really community into her hands, and makes a decision that is very noteworthy. So we're going to begin here and read first of all the first 13 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 25. It tells us here, "Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Maon. A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, a Calebite, was surly and mean in his dealings. While David was in the desert, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name, and say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours.' Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them. And the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable towards my young men. Since we come at a festive time, please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name, and then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. And David said to his men, "Put on your swords." So they put on their swords, and David put on his. And about 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. We're going to stop there for the time being and just get caught up here a little bit on what is taking place here in the beginning of this story. Those of us who are familiar with this book of the Bible and familiar with this story, we know where it's leading. And those of us who just are paying attention to what the Bible tells us here can realize what is taking shape here. So it begins by telling us here very kind of nonchalantly and very briefly that Samuel now has died. And Ashton, if you want to put that slide up of the timeline, have a slide for you here on this PowerPoint of a timeline here of 1 Samuel. And so 1 Samuel 25 tells us here now that Samuel has died. Samuel has been a pretty big part of this part of this book here thus far. We haven't read too much about him in the last few chapters, but that's only because Saul and Samuel have been estranged. We know that Samuel has given Saul the message that God has rejected him, and we were told several chapters back that Saul and Samuel had no interaction in this last little while. I believe it's probably been maybe close to 7 years since Saul and Samuel have seen each other or interacted in any meaningful way. But you can see here that it tells us there down 2/3, 3/4 of the way down that Samuel dies, and it shows us there that would have been about 1011 BC. Now, Samuel was born all the way up at the top there. It says there 1100 BC. In my Bible timeline, in the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, it says that Samuel was born in 1105 BC. So let's just do a little bit of quick math. How old was Samuel? Early 90s. Late 80s, early 90s. All right? If he died in somewhere around 1011 BC, and he was born in 11 or 1105 BC, that's somewhere around 90, couple more, couple less, depending on exactly when it was. One place mentioned that Samuel would have died in 1012 BC, so nevertheless, a year or two, I'm not sure really matters, but Samuel had lived a long life. Samuel had lived a long time and had led Israel, and I find it kind of fascinating that there's not any more here about Samuel other than this simple sentence. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. All that Samuel had done for the people of Israel, and this is what it comes down to. Now Samuel died. Now it does tell us that all Israel assembled and mourned. It does wonder me, and I'll put the question to you. We're not told. We don't know for sure. We can make some assumptions. But do you think King Saul went to Samuel's funeral? Anybody want to offer their opinion? Did King Saul attend Samuel's funeral? What? No. I think you're probably right, those of you who would say no. Now it says all Israel assembled and mourned for him. Now I'm guessing that was probably primarily the leaders of the tribes and the people who not every last person of Israel. That wouldn't have been the case, but it was proclaimed throughout the land that Samuel had died. And there was great mourning for Samuel. And it tells us that they buried him at his home in Ramah, which, we'll move to that map here in just a minute here. Just hang on to this one yet, Ashton, for now. But so Samuel was probably in his late 80s, early 90s when he died. He had led Israel. He was both prophet, priest, and judge. He was really considered the last of the judges of Israel, and he was the one through whom God allowed his people, the Israelites, to begin this monarchy, this age and time of having a king of their own. He, of course, had anointed Saul, and we know that he had anointed David to follow Saul. And that was only because God had rejected Saul, but Samuel had done a lot for the nation of Israel, and they mourned for him here. But we really have no more in the text about Samuel's passing. And it struck me too, in reading this and in thinking about this, isn't it so true that the human existence really comes down to that, doesn't it? We live and we do a lot of things in life. And hopefully we make a difference and we make an impact in our world in the time we live. But for all of us, no matter who we are, no matter high or low or in between, as far as in the class of life or in the station in life, when the end comes, we die and we're buried and life goes on. Now, we believe, of course, that there is eternal life through Jesus Christ, but for life itself, that's the bare truth. And so Samuel dies. He's gone from the scene now. Now, we know he comes up a little bit later, and we'll get into that in probably next Sunday or the next, where Saul tries to communicate with Samuel through a medium. But nevertheless, Samuel dies, and it tells us now, it doesn't really say that it's because Samuel is gone now, but we do wonder what caused David to decide to move his location now that Samuel is gone. Was it because Samuel is gone now and he felt a little safer? And let's move to that other map now, Ashton. Yes, there we go. David has been in the forest of Hereth, the wilderness of Ziph, in that area, but we see now that this story takes us down further to Carmel, which is towards the bottom there, and Maon, and the wilderness of Maon, where this story takes place in 1 Samuel 25. Why was it that David decided to move? We're not really told. Did it have something to do with the fact that Samuel was gone now? Did he feel safer down there further south in the land of Judah? We don't really know for sure, but it just tells us that that's what David did. He moved down into the desert of Maon. And now we're introduced to this man, a certain man from the desert of Maon. And this man, it tells us, was very wealthy. He had 1,000 sheep and 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep. How many of you know any farmers or ranchers? You have any idea how many animals they have? Many? That many? Any of you know any farmers that have 1,000 cows? Like milking cows, shall we say? Okay? Now, if we went out west, you could probably name some. And there's probably some around even, around these parts that may have more than that. But, 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep in that day was a sign of a very wealthy individual. We remember back in the book of Genesis and all of the livestock and the possessions that Abraham had. Abraham was considered a very wealthy man. Well, here we are introduced to this man from Carmel, who is a very wealthy man, has 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, and it was shearing time. And this man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. Now we're told here in the end of verse 3 that Nabal was a Calebite, and he was surly and mean in his dealings. Now, I looked up surly in the dictionary. That's not a word that we use too often. I doubt if any of you used that word in the last, probably never. Thank you, Pat. That's probably correct. Surly is not a word that we use too often. What do you think surly meant or means? Anybody want to guess? Know-it-all? Okay. He might have been a know-it-all. Didn't say that in the dictionary. Don? Miserable? Okay. What? Rough? Okay. Cranky? Well, you see if this coincides with what comes to your mind when you think of somebody who is surly. Dictionary that I have said that surly means uncivil, bad-tempered. Uncivil, bad-tempered. And you can add in all of your other adjectives that you want to. Do any of you know any people who might fit into that category? Don't name any names. At least not if they're here this morning. No, I'm just kidding. Nabal was a Calebite, and I'm not quite sure what the implication is there, labeling him as a Calebite, other than maybe from the tribe of Caleb. I'm not sure exactly if he was or not, but nevertheless, it says that this man Nabal was surly and mean. He was bad-tempered. He was obnoxious. He was whatever other word you might want to use there, uncivil. He was just kind of a miserable man. Very wealthy, yet very miserable. And I'm guessing that some of you might have, if you don't know anybody like that, you may have heard of someone like that. And yet, it says he was married to this lady named Abigail, who was both intelligent and beautiful. Now, how could have something like that ever happened? Well, now listen. Now, wait a minute now. Arranged marriage. There you go. That's probably the key. All right? It was arranged probably by the parents of the bride and the groom. I don't know how the whole system worked, but nevertheless, it was some kind of an arranged marriage. And Abigail's parents probably thought she should feel honored to be the wife of such a wealthy man. How wealthy he was when they got married, we don't really know. We don't have any more of the story, but nevertheless, here is Abigail, an intelligent and beautiful woman, married to Nabal, who is surly and mean and uncivil and bad-tempered. Now, we don't have arranged marriages so much anymore, right? At least not so much in our society anyhow and in our culture. But does that still ever happen? Does. How does that happen? Well, there may be a lot of reasons how that happens. But it probably happens more often than what we would ever think it should. That somehow beautiful men, or even maybe good, beautiful women, get hooked up with undisciplined and mean and bad-tempered men, or vice versa. It happens the opposite way too. I'm sure some of you can attest to that as well. But nevertheless, we can't necessarily just blame this on arranged marriages, although that was probably the case, most likely the situation that had occurred here. But it seems to be part of human nature that somehow, some way, people that really seem like they shouldn't be united because of their complete difference in character and just all of the different things that go into that, should be connected in that way and connected in marriage, but it happens. And so anyhow, here we are introduced to Nabal and Abigail, and it goes on to tell us that David, while he was in the desert, heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. They're down there in the desert of Maon. Nabal is from the town of Carmel, and he apparently had his flocks and herds wandering through the wilderness of Maon with the shepherds. And David, while he was in the desert of Maon, had provided some protection for them. And so anyhow, David sends messengers to ask Nabal, since it's sheep shearing time, and you're having this festive time, you're shearing sheep, you're having celebrations, you're killing some of your animals, you're having lots of food and all of that. Would you be willing to give us some provisions? Essentially is what he's asking his servants. David, it says, sent 10 of his servants, 10 of his young men, to go up to Nabal at Carmel and ask if it would be possible to get some provisions for them. Here they were, 600 of them in the desert, and they had provided some, shall we say, services, although it was not necessarily requested, we don't necessarily believe, but it was kind of a common practice that if there was groups of people like that, and David and his men and certainly were a large group of people, that they would provide protection for the local shepherds and stuff from anyone else who might be coming through the area and wanting to do harm or evil or whatever and take advantage of. And so David sends his messengers to Nabal asking about getting some provisions. And so they do this, and Nabal's response is a very harsh and unkind response. Who is this David? And why should I give my bread and water and meat to someone that comes from who knows where? And he acts like he's never heard of David. It's hard to believe that Nabal didn't know about David, that he didn't know about King Saul, and that he didn't know about all of the other things. We get the impression from Abigail's response a little bit later, and we'll get to that then, but we see that Abigail seems to know something about the fact that David has been fleeing from King Saul or fleeing from someone. So it's very likely that they knew about David, and whether or not this was just Nabal's way of acting like, well, who is this David? I don't, there's many masters, he says, breaking away, or many servants breaking away from their masters and such and such. And so anyhow, in spite of the fact that Nabal probably had realized and known about the protection that David and his men had provided his shepherds and his servants when they had the sheep and the goats in the wilderness and were going from place to place, in spite of knowing that, he didn't want anything to do with sharing any provisions with David and his men. And so in his own nature and in his own mean and bad-tempered way, he responds very negatively to David's servants. And so it tells us that David's men report back to David. And what does David do? David's switch is flipped in an instant. Have you ever been in front of somebody who has just gotten angry over, in a moment? Well, this is what happened here. David instantly reacts in anger and in rage. Now, we don't know what else was going on. We know David was running from Saul. We don't know what else was going on in David's life. It's likely maybe there was some other things that just were eating at him, maybe. I don't know. But nevertheless, Nabal's response of ingratitude and mean and ungrateful response causes David to tell his men, strap on your swords, we're going to go and we're going to take care of this our way. We're going to deal with it our way with the edge of our swords. Now remember, this is the same David who not so long ago had Saul right in front of him, could have taken his life, and could have, at least in the minds of all of his men, been very justified by doing that after all that Saul had done to him and was trying to do to him. But we know that David refrained. Do we see David in this passage seeking God's direction? No. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Kind of interesting that we don't read anything that David's reached out to God and that he sought his guidance and direction. Okay, what do I do? This guy's being mean and I'm getting mad. David says, strap on your swords, guys. We're going, and we're going now. And so it tells us here that David and 400 of his men, 200 stayed with the supplies wherever they were camped, and 400 men headed with David towards Carmel and towards the camp of Nabal. All right, let's read a little more here now. Picking up now at verse 14. One of the servants told Nabal's wife Abigail, David sent messengers from the desert to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day they were a wall around us. All the time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. Abigail lost no time. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, go on ahead, and I'll follow you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, it's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the desert, so that nothing useless. No, wait. It's all been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the desert, so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet, and she said, my lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. May my lord pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name is Fool, and folly goes with him. But as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my master sent. Now since the Lord has kept you, my master, from bloodshed, and from avenging yourself with your own hands, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, may your enemies and all who intend to harm my master be like Nabal. And let this gift which your servant has brought to my master be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's offense, for the Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my master, because he fights the Lord's battles. Let no wrongdoing be found in you as long as you live, even though someone is pursuing you to take your life. The life of my master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has done for my master every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him leader over Israel, my master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed, or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord has brought my master success, remember your servant." We're going to stop there again, and we're going to take a look at what happens next here. So one of the servants who overheard David's men talking to Nabal and heard Nabal's response and understood probably just the body language of the servants who came to Nabal, and understood the times in which they were living, and understood just things in that day. And again, some of these Bible stories we, in some senses, have a hard time relating to because they're so different from our culture today. But that was the way things were dealt with and handled in that day. And there was not government as we have it today back in those days. But nevertheless, so we see this servant overhears this conversation between David's servants and Nabal, and he realizes that Nabal has ticked these guys off, and he knows that disaster is hanging over them, and they probably know that David and his men are many in number, and so he goes to he goes to Abigail, and he says to her, David sent messengers, and Nabal was very unkind to them and insultful. And but all of David's men had been good to us. They watched over us, all of our sheep and cattle, or sheep and goats, and supplies. Nothing was missing while David and his men were there for us. And so he goes and tells Abigail, and he says, "Now you think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." This man, this servant, along with all the rest of them probably, and Abigail realized, and Abigail mentions something here in her response to David about how wicked her husband Nabal is. But they all realized that Nabal wasn't going to listen to anybody. And I think when we try to see how this story applies in our own lives and in our own world, we find that there are sometimes people in life that just will not listen to anybody, right? They're right, and they're always right. And they're never going to be wrong, no matter what anybody says. And so sometimes things have to be done, and this is where we see the character, the wisdom, and the willingness to take action on the part of Abigail comes. And it's a beautiful story here of Abigail realizing. It says Abigail lost no time. It says Abigail lost no time. She acted quickly. She gathered all of these things, whether they were made already or she quickly made them. I don't know, but nevertheless, she took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, and all of these other things, and she loaded them on donkeys, and she set out, and she decided that she was going to do something. And we have here, and I want to share this illustration here right now. I think this servant who overheard the conversation between Nabal and David's servants and Abigail are individuals who qualify as someone who don't fall in this category. But Charles Swindoll says there is a story about 4 people, and they're named everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. And there was an important job to do, he says, and everybody was asked to do it. Everybody, though, was sure that somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry because it was everybody's job, and everybody thought that anybody would do it, but nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it, and it ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have done. So here we have Abigail and this servant doing what needed to be done in this moment and in this time. And so here they are. They've gathered up all these supplies, and they're heading towards where David and his men are. And it tells us here that as Abigail came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending towards her. That must have been quite a scene. Can you imagine it? David and 400 of his men heading towards Carmel, out of the wilderness, and Abigail and all these donkeys and whatever servants she had with her loaded with these supplies coming to meet these 400 men, bent on avenging themselves because they had done good and Nabal was mean and angry, and they were going to get back and they were going to pay him back. Doesn't it provide for us just a picture of the total depravity of humanity? And we can't excuse ourselves either. At least I can't excuse myself, because there's times when my trigger gets tripped and I say things and I do things that I shouldn't do and that I have to apologize for later on. But here we see this man Nabal just tripping the trigger of David in such a way that David is going to go and he is going to avenge himself, and he is going to deal with this man, and he is going to pay him back for the kindness that he should have shown to him and his men. And here comes Abigail, this intelligent and wise woman who gathers all these supplies, and she knows that if she doesn't do something and do it quickly, disaster is about to overtake them. What a beautiful story of her action, her understanding, and her willingness to just get moving. And it tells us that she didn't even tell her husband, because she knew it would be useless, because he would probably get mad at her and he would probably try to stop her or whatever. Nevertheless, it tells us that when she sees David, she gets down off her donkey, she bows to the ground, and she says all of these things. She says, may you listen to me and hear what I have to say. Nabal, my husband, is a fool, and folly goes with him. But she says, listen, I wasn't there when your servants came, or things would be different, or I would have realized what was going on. But listen to me. And I find it kind of interesting here that she understands that what she is doing is really keeping David from sinning and doing something that he's going to regret later on. Has anybody ever stopped you from doing something that you would have regretted? Or has anybody ever, have you ever maybe at least tried to stop somebody from doing something that they would regret later on? Well, here we have Abigail, and she realizes that David is on a mission here to do something that he's going to regret, because he really didn't have true justification for doing what he was intent on doing, because he was just angry. He was just angry because Nabal was so mean and so ungrateful and so rude and insultful of him and all they had done for them. And, maybe part of all this was too just all of the pressure that David was under as he was running from Saul and trying to stay safe and all of this, and it just boiled over. in these moments. And here he was trying to do a good deed. He was trying to protect Nabal and all of his flocks and servants and all. And Nabal responds with rudeness and insults and meanness. And so Abigail realizes that she is coming to David and pleading with him and offering him provisions to stop him from doing what she knows he will regret later on. I find it interesting too here that she mentions here, even though someone is pursuing you, she kind of offers really some blessings on David, but then she says, even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of your master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. Abigail really says some things here to David that are very powerful here, really, and realizing that and she's kind of pronouncing a blessing on him as being the Lord's anointed, and that even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, I'm sure all of Israel realized what was going on between Saul and David by this time, and especially now that Samuel was gone, and they realized that Saul was bent on taking David's life, and that Saul was really not the king that he was supposed to be, and that David was going to succeed him. And so I think this was probably common knowledge to most of the people at that time, and Abigail really refers to it here when she says, I know that someone is pursuing you to take your life. And so she concludes her comments to David and her plea with David there as she offers him all of these provisions and supplies. And she says to him, and when the Lord has brought my master success, remember your servant. We just see a real picture of humility and wisdom and grace in this woman Abigail, that is just mind-boggling in some senses when you see the man that she was paired with. This intelligent, beautiful, and wise woman, and she takes action here and says to David as she concludes her talk here. She says, "And when the Lord has brought my master's success, remember your servant." And so now let's read the last part of this chapter. So David says to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought to him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk, so she told him nothing until daybreak. Then in the morning when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him because he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong, and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." Then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife." She bowed down with her face to the ground and said, "Here is your maidservant, ready to serve you and wash the feet of your master's servants." Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 maids, went with David's messengers and became his wife. David had also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they were both his wives. But Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Paltiel, son of Laish, who was from Galim. And that concludes chapter 25. So here we see David now responding to Abigail. And David realizes right away, and I'm sure that David knew in his heart even as he and his men were going down to meet Nabal and avenge himself, that what he was doing was probably not what he should have been doing. And maybe God was nudging at his heart too, and realizing that, hey, you haven't sought me, you haven't sought my face in what you should do in this case and in this situation. And David praises Abigail here, he praises her and blesses her, but he says, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to meet me today." David realizes that God is the one ultimately who prompted Abigail to do what she did to keep him from this needless bloodshed. And so we see that David accepts from Abigail this gift, and he tells her to go home in peace, and that they will accept her gift, and they will go back to their camp, and there will be no bloodshed, there will be no harm done, and you go home and thank you very much for all that you have done. And so we see now, as the story concludes, that Abigail goes to Nabal as she gets back home, and Nabal's drunk and he's having a party in the house, and who all's with him we don't know, but it's not even worth talking to him again and telling him what she has just done. So she waits till morning, and she tells him in the morning, and as a result of what she tells him, and we don't know exactly what it is that causes him. Is it because of the news of what he realized? That he realized that they were so close to disaster, or what? But nevertheless, he probably had a stroke, is what it seems like. It says he became like a stone, was not able to move or whatever, and 10 days later, he died. And so God, in his wisdom and in his understanding, he took care of Nabal, and he punished Nabal for his meanness and for his bad attitude and for his unkindness towards his servant David. And so just a fascinating story here, that as Nabal dies then, and then Abigail becomes David's wife, we know too, or we see here too, that David has taken another woman as a wife, and Saul has given his daughter Michal to someone else now. We know that Michal had been David's wife, but now that Saul and David are at odds, anyhow, so that's how the story concludes here, with just this information here and details of what happens here. But Abigail becomes David's wife, and I think there's just a few things that I would like us to just take away from this whole story. And it's, first of all, thinking about what do we do. We touched on it a little bit already, but what do we do when we get angry? This was David's problem here. David became angry because Nabal didn't treat them very kindly. Let's turn back to the New Testament and Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26. What does it tell us here? In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. In your anger, do not sin. How many of us get angry? We all get angry from time to time, right? And sometimes maybe our anger is stronger than at other times. Depends on the situation. Maybe it depends on what all's going on in our life, right? And what all's happening at the time. But we all get angry. But in your anger, do not sin. Now, David would have sinned for sure by what he was about to do here. We see that he hadn't reached out to God. He hadn't called out to God and asked God what he should do in spite of Nabal's surly meanness and all. But he had definitely not sought God's God's help and his strength. I want to turn yet to James chapter 1 and verse 19, where James tells us here, he says, "My brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." Anger is something that comes from our sinful nature, and it's something that is taken advantage of, I should say, by our sinful anger. It's one of our emotions, and it's an emotion that God gave us. And I think it's appropriate and it's right. We see that God is angry at times throughout the scripture. We read about God's anger. But being angry in and of itself is not wrong. It's how we handle that anger. And as Ephesians says, in your anger, do not sin. And here in James, it says we should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. We will get angry at times, but it's how we handle that anger that makes the difference. And in this case, we see that if it wouldn't have been for Abigail, David would have done something that he would have regretted greatly down the road and down the line. And it can be the same for us. We need to be careful about how anger grips us and how it will sometimes cause us to do and say things that we would regret later on. The second thing I think that we see here is just overall this message of the wisdom of Abigail in this situation. Abigail was in a situation where I'd venture to guess she maybe wasn't all that happy in her marriage. Would you guess? Would you maybe agree with me there? Now, in that day and in that time, there was no choice, though. There was no choice. She had to live with it. But nevertheless, we see that Abigail, in spite of her dissatisfaction probably in her marriage and her realization that she was married to an idiot and a fool, she called him a fool, she continued to be a woman who feared the Lord. What does Psalm 111:10 tell us? I think it says there that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I believe Abigail indeed had a respect and a healthy and a righteous fear of God. She was a worshiper of God, I believe, and she was a person who had wisdom. It tells us she was intelligent and beautiful, but that doesn't make up for the wisdom that she expressed and demonstrated here in these verses. When we look at the book of James again in chapter 3, what does it tell us there about times when we're not sure what to do? Or we're not sure if we realize that we lack wisdom. It's verse 13 here. It says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by the deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom." Abigail was a person who expressed her wisdom through her humility. The humility that she had came from the wisdom that God gave her. And so I think these two themes really stand out in this story of how we deal with anger and the fact that wisdom is something that we can only get from God and from seeking his face and from trusting him and looking to him. And then also I wanted to just remind us again of the scripture that Rick read for us in the opening, where we're warned by Peter that we should be careful about allowing the devil to get any foothold in your life, because our enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. The devil was on the prowl that day when David heard the news of what Nabal said to his servants and how he responded to them. And the devil almost got his way in David's life. And he wants to do that in each one of our lives as well. If we don't seek him, and if we don't seek his face. I want to share this illustration in closing. Edward Everett Hale, who was a distinguished poet and former chaplain of the U.S. Senate, eloquently captured the essence, he says, of every American's duty. And he would have said this: I am only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. What I can do, that I ought to do. And what I ought to do, by the grace of God, I shall do. Can we take that for ourselves today as we leave this place, that by the grace of God, even though we are just one, what we can do, we will do by God's grace and by God's strength to be the person that he wants us to be in the world and in our lives and in our day-to-day. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word this morning. We thank you for this fascinating and insightful and just intriguing story here of how you worked in this situation and in this circumstance to truly bring honor and glory to your name and to just work out your will and your plan and your purposes in this portion of your story here in 1 Samuel. And I pray, Lord, this morning now that as we conclude this service, you might just enable us to experience and know your filling in our hearts, that we might be all that you would have us to be as we go out into our world once again this day. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.